New topic, installing the wiring that goes to the Tour-Pak. Okay, now not every Ultra or electric line is going to be the same. This disconnect kit goes all the way back to 97, and I don't know what kind of lighting was in a Tour-Pak in 97, but it seems like they added more lighting over time. So not every bike is going to be the same here. Now, this particular bike has two 6-pin connectors right on the outside of the Tour-Pak, and you can see those on the arrow on the right. And they come out of the Tour-Pak about 8 inches, and they're really heavy duty connectors. They're really good automotive connectors, so you can actually slide the male part inside of the female part, and then the inside wire terminals start connecting. You can't put it on wrong, and you should be able to connect and disconnect this quite a few times. So there's two 6-pin connectors, and there's also a 4-pin connector that's inside of the Tour-Pak, and you have to move that to the outside. So here's the third connector, and unfortunately, like I said, it's on the inside of the Tour-Pak, and you don't want it there because to take the Tour-Pak off every time you would have to take the lining out of the Tour-Pak, which is a pain in the butt, and disconnect it and then connect it again when you want to put it back on. So you don't want that. And it's a little bit deceiving looking at this picture here. On the right, you can see the connector, but if you pull that antenna wire through, then the connector is inside of the Tour-Pak, and you can see the other end. There's a pair of GB wire cutters down there on the bottom that I use to flip up the connector so you can see the end of it. So it's a 3-pin connector, and it's connected to this antenna lead. So you want to cut the nylon ties that are on the outside of the rubber. So cut a few of those off, and then cut the rubber, use a pair of scissors instead of a razor so you don't cut the insulation on anything. And just cut that rubber back about 10 inches at least. So what you want to do to decide where to cut the wire off is, before you cut it off, feed it through the Tour-Pak and connect it inside of the Tour-Pak, and then just cut it off where the other 2 wires are, and then put a new connector in there, and then you'll have all 3 of your connectors in about the same place. So on the right, you can see that for some reason, back when I ordered this, I didn't know how many 4-pin or 3-pin connectors there would be. So I ordered a 3-pin connector that was triangular so I could tell it apart from like a 4-pin connector. But it turns out there's only one. But anyways, this connector works just fine. It's heavy duty, and it's a 3-pin connector, just triangular instead of square. So, measure it, put it inside the Tour-Pak, the part that you see on the upper left, and measure how long you want it to be, and then cut it off there, and then that's where you're going to put your new wire connector in. Now I'm just showing you a wire cutter here that's really fast. This tool I think came out of Japan first, maybe about a decade ago, and then China started making them, and now Gardner Bender makes them, and they're $15 from Gardner Benders that are really pretty cheap. I don't know whether they have theirs made in Japan or China or what, but it's a really fast wire stripper if you've got a lot of work to do. Now I have a bunch of really good wire strippers from Mac tools and GB, and the ones with the round holes for each gauge of wire are still more precise than this, because this one tends to cut off one wire every time you use it, but it is fast, really fast. So the way you use it, there's on the right picture, the bottom arrow shows a gauge, and you can put that gauge anywhere you want to and put the wire up to it, and that'll cut all the wires in the same place. When you start squeezing, the top left arrow on the right is a clamp. It comes down on the wire, and then the other side of it has like a blade, and it'll cut off the insulation. And as you squeeze, the first thing that happens is the left side, the vise comes together, basically the little pair of pliers there, and then the right side starts coming down, and then as you squeeze more, it separates and it pulls the end of the wire off. It's just really quick to use this if you want to consider this thing. Even better are these Gardner Bender wire cutters where they have a different cutter, different, I guess, cutter for every gauge wire. So, the bad thing about the one on the previous page, it's really fast to use. You can just, strip 10 wires in 5 seconds. But these take just a couple seconds longer, and these will never cut more wires, than what you need. The one on the previous page usually takes out 1 wire. And when you're dealing with really, really fine grade wires, like the wires that lead to your LED lights, you want to use something like this. Then I have the art of shrink wrap stacking. So I do this all the time. And when I'm working in automotive stuff, I always put a few layers of shrink wrap in. So here you can see on the left, I have some shrink wrap already put on the connector ends. That's going to connect to the Harley wiring. And on the right, you can see the Harley wiring. And I have a big piece of shrink wrap that's maybe, I don't know, 1/2 inch or something like that, or 3/4 or 5/8 or something. A big hunk of shrink wrap, and then another big hunk of shrink wrap stuffed inside of that. And then I have the red, black, and white, because I didn't have any blue shrink wrap, stuffed inside of that black piece. So why am I stuffing them together? Because you can put 12 inches of shrink wrap in a space about the size of 8 inches if you start stuffing them inside of each other. And what that does for you is it gets the shrink wrap away from the heat. Okay, so that's the purpose of doing this. So here on the left, I show you the first layer of shrink wrap is on the connector. It doesn't really matter which little pieces are the first layer. You can put them on the other side if you want. And then on the right picture, the bottom, the second layer of shrink wrap is stuffed inside of the black stuff. And then the black things would be your third and fourth layers. And this is how I butt connect wires together usually. Separate the strands and wrap them, twist them halfway or a little bit less than halfway, and then put them together. Actually, the first thing you should do is separate the strands and then dip them in flux, and then start twisting them together. And then you should have something that looks like the picture on the right. You can also butt join them and just push the wires together. I've just found it's a little more difficult to keep the wires from popping out when you're soldering. And like the picture on the left here, I set up a little working space here on the bike. Just put a piece of, just grab a stool, work stool, and grab a piece of wood and put it across the frame of your bike. I got the digital soldering gun ready to roll here, and a little piece of ceramic at the end of the board. I didn't even realize that I'm not at my workbench. If you set this up right, nice little work area to do some soldering. So on the left, you can see a bunch of these wires have already been twisted together and they're ready to be soldered. On the right, I'm starting to solder. You can see the flux coming out, and the digital soldering gun is set at 375 degrees. And then on the left, you can see the first layer of shrink wrap covering up the jointed wires, the soldered wires. And on the right, the first layer of shrink wrap is heated already and shrunk. And you can see the second layer is still sticking in that black piece. So you put the first layer on and shrink wrap, or heat it up, shrink it. And the first piece only needs to be maybe 1 inch long or 1.5 inches. I got these kind of long. And then your second layer should cover the first layer, from end to end. And then here on the left, I'm putting the bigger pieces of shrink wrap on it, and that's basically just to keep the wires together. And if you go to twist up the wires, they're not going to separate because you have something to replace that black tubing that Harley gave you. And on the right, I actually decided to put some split loom wire wrap. This is like a little conduit that's split. There's kind of an art to doing this. It's really easy. You just put it on later because it's split, so you can solder the wires first. But just bend it where you're putting it on. Open up the ends and get it started on the wiring, and then just bend it. Keep that curve moving like a wave all the way up the wire, and it'll actually attach itself. You can put this on in a matter of seconds. Now this is definitely not a big deal here, but I decided to put the female connector um, toward the Tour-Pak because Harley did the same thing. And another thing, I wound up making that connector a little bit longer than the other two because when you connect it to the wires that are underneath the seat, I didn't want two connectors on the same side to be, I didn't want the connectors to be next to each other. It's just harder to manage them underneath the seat and than it is to stagger them. You have a lot more room to stuff them somewhere when they're, when they're underneath the seat. So the result here, you relocated the wire connector that was inside of the Tour-Pak and to the outside, and now you have three wires to disconnect. And the other two wires were the antenna leads, which are going to run directly to the new antenna location, not inside of the Tour-Pak. So basically, you disconnect these three wires, you pop off your Tour-Pak, and you're done. Now this is just a mirror I have in the shop because sometimes you need a mirror. And this here I'm testing the lights before I take the Tour-Pak off and finish the rest of the bike. So, whatever your lights did before, it might be a good idea to, play with your lights before you start working and figure out what lights are in the Tour-Pak. So this Tour-Pak, goes from 1997 to 2008, and I'm sure that the lights inside of the Tour-Pak changed a lot. And, for this particular model, the lights in the Tour-Pak in the back and the running lights along the bottom on the side are both running lights and brake lights, but there's no turn signals inside the Tour-Pak. I know on the newer models, the Tour-Pak is your turn signals. So just test your lights, make sure they work okay, and they should work okay if you did a real good job soldering. And then you're ready to pack up the Tour-Pak and get it off the bike. So here it shows on the left, the Tour-Pak is already put back together. And the little pouch is there too, and it's ready to roll. You just disconnect the three wires, take the Tour-Pak off, and put it somewhere, and you're ready to work on the rest of the bike. New topic, installing the rear facade or the filler, fender extension, whatever you want to call it. So this is a short section. Unfortunately, there's just no way to loosen the bolts on that triangular piece so you can get the filler put in on both sides. It just doesn't work. I tried it. I spent, a half hour trying to do it. And then I just decided to remove the triangular pieces and reinstall them through that facade. So what I did in the meantime is I put some 3M outdoor double back tape. I ripped it down the middle and I put it on the outside of the filler and stuck it to the fender where I wanted it, just to keep it there until I was done playing here. And, unfortunately, there's no easy solution to this. You just have to take it apart again and put it back together through the fender filler. New topic, running the wiring for the new rear end lighting. Now, what I'm actually working on here now is multiple things because I'm waiting for parts to come in. So you might see some pictures in here that are like further along than, doing the lighting. And you might have seen some lighting in the previous pictures. I'm just putting this together in topics on this slideshow and in the video according to sections. But sometimes if you look at the pictures, you might see that the wiring's already done when I'm working on the rear fender extension, and other things won't completely make sense chronologically because I'm working on a bunch of things at once. So you're going to need some extra wiring because the leads coming off of that connector aren't going to go all the way to the back end, and the lights in the back end aren't going to come all the way to the front of the fender. Now I always try to use a similar colored wiring, and I want to stick with the Harley wires to make a Harley harness here. That way in the future, if you or the next owner of this bike wants to tap into one of these, it makes sense. It's the same color as the wiring diagrams. So if you go up to eBay and look for these, sets, this is 11 colors, 10 feet a piece. and you can get, the same 11 colors, 25 feet a piece if you want. I find it, unless you're working with a stereo system on a car, the amount of wiring that you need working in the automotive, working underneath the hood of a car or working on a motorcycle, you're probably only going to need a couple feet of wire. So this, 10 feet will do, and it'll give you some extra wire for the future. So this is a 16 gauge primary wire. It's the same gauge as inside of the Harley wiring harness. And, just keep it the same color as Harley, because the lights in the back are, crazy colors. Actually, a couple of the Harley ones are kind of crazy too, because it's kind of a standard to have yellow and green be your turn signal wires. And Harley uses, I think, purple and brown. But, make it the same as Harley, and that way everything will be Harley. Now, in this section, I have a bunch of information here on this new wave soldering, low temperature soldering stuff. These are called solder seal connectors, and maybe you've seen them in some YouTube commercials as you're looking for your Harley videos. And, I kind of wondered, how mainstream this is, whether it's used in the automotive industry. So I actually, I live in the Northeast Ohio, in the Akron area, and I know a girl who works at a supply house that supplies, they start out supplying all the, Goodyear and Firestone stores across the country, so, tens of thousands of locations. And then they expanded to some other, shops, I don't know, like Tuffy or Midas or, other automotive shops. I'm not quite sure who they supply, but, they're in the business of being the one supplier that can, supply anything that an automotive shop needs. You get the tires from, the big tire companies, but everything else in the shop comes from, a supplier. It's a lot easier to deal with one supplier than 100. So, I called her up and asked her if they carry this stuff, and she said no, they don't have it yet. So that made me think, well, maybe it's not that mainstream. Maybe it's not used in the professional automotive world yet. But I, ordered a set of these anyways, because I've seen enough commercials on them, and I like the idea. And, I like the idea that it does solder with a heat gun at low temperature, and I converted that. I think it's like 230 degrees as opposed to 475 degrees to melt solder, your typical solder. So I thought I would give this stuff a try, but it ended up that I didn't use it. That doesn't mean that you can't use it. I just found that, in the stuff that I was doing, there just wasn't enough room to use this stuff, or, for some other reason, I decided, not to use it. But if you want to use it, this is a viable solution. So it's called solder seal connectors sometimes. It seems that everybody who sells this stuff calls it something different. But what it is some heat shrink tubing that's clear, and it also has some low temperature solder in the middle that'll melt at 230 degrees. So you take a heat gun to it, and it'll melt the solder as you're twisting the wire around. There's a couple different ways of doing it. You can clamp your heat gun into a vise or something and twist the wire around, or you can shield whatever wherever you're working with a bunch of aluminum foil, and then use the heat gun and twist, hold the heat gun in your hand and try to twist a wire around with your other hand. So here's a better look at this stuff, and on the right you can see the before and after pictures. The white one you can see on the blue wire, which is pretty heavy gauge stuff. I can't read the gauge on it, but it'd be like 10 to 12 gauge probably. And when you heat this stuff, it does shrink right around the wiring, so you can see just by looking at it, from the outside, that it's sealed against the blue, insulation on the wire. And you can also see that the low temperature solder has melted and fused together the wires. So this is getting more and more popular. and it's a something you can consider. Now here's a photo on the right, or on the left you can see it dipping underwater. On the right they have a little jar filled with water and goldfish. I just noticed that. So, they have it's a waterproof rating of IP67, which is a waterproof rating, a legitimate rating, and it's in the automotive world. I don't know where else that rating exists. It's just something you're used to seeing in the automotive world. But it's, it makes a waterproof seal, and these heat shrink things also have, a layer that they call adhesive, and that's the color. So, like in the blue connector, it'll be all clear except for the blue, and that's supposed to be the adhesive. So it works. You can see here it's lighting up a light bulb, even though the connectors are underwater in a bowl with goldfish. It wasn't until I saw a commercial or an ad on YouTube from Summit Racing. Now, Summit Racing is also in town here, and it just happens to be the world's largest supplier of high-performance automotive parts. And probably, if you've got a car that you're souping up a little bit with some performance parts, chances are what Summit Racing is, because they're all they've got these huge stores that are all across the country, and you can order anything from them. And they're carrying this. They're calling it heat shrink self solder butt splice connectors. But anyways, when I saw that Summit Racing is offering it now, I thought, well, if it's good enough for Summit Racing, it's good enough for me. And if you can watch one video here where it shows them twisting this wire back and forth and shrinking, you can see that it has adhered to the two pieces of wire and soldered in the middle, and it's just a really good video to show how this works. But when I saw this, it doesn't matter to me what other automotive centers like it. If it's good enough for Summit Racing, it's good enough for me. But keep in mind that you have to have some room to do this. When you're working on your bike, it might not be convenient to use a heat gun. So just keep that in mind. I bought this stuff, and I was looking forward to using it and cutting some time out, but it turned out that I never did have enough room to use a heat gun. So here's a couple of confusing pictures here. These are both for Harley, from Harley Davidson, and they kind of contradict each other. On the picture on the left, you can see brown, orange and white, V, I guess it was violet, then black, then red and yellow, then blue, then black. So the right turn signal and left turn signal are brown and purple, basically. I don't know why they call this violet. On the right is a picture for an Electroglide in the same year, and it shows the purple and black going to both the right and left turn signals. And the reason you can do that is, it depends on how your actual blinker up on the circuit board, or up, in a car, your flasher is just a little piece of, round aluminum that's in your fuse box area. That's the flasher. Now, depending on how you wire that, you can use the same leads for both the left and right turn signal. So I didn't know what I was going to deal with here until I took the turn signal assembly apart and saw what color wires. But on my bike, it was like the diagram on the left, even though that's a Street Glide, and the Ultra is on the right. Mine had the wiring of the Street Glide. So it had the purple and brown were the turn signal hot leads. Also, if you take a look at the wiring that comes with your LED strips, if you're going to use LED strips, you can see that they use green and yellow, black, red, and white. Now, this is somewhat standardized, internationally. And the reason that Harley doesn't use, the green and yellow and black, red, and white is because the wiring harness on a Harley is so big that they decided, probably these colors are used elsewhere, maybe in the front turn signals. So usually a manufacturer will just use all kinds of different colors, just so you can tell, what they are, so they don't duplicate the wires, in the front end and the back end, because somewhere in the wiring harness you might get confused, is this the lead that goes to the front end or the back end? So they use a bunch of different colors. I think it's a good idea to use the Harley colors because you're working on a Harley. So even though the LED wires, yellow and green is kind of standard for the turn signal colors. And then of course, your black and white are the lead for the running light, and your red is a brake light. That's like an international standard. So these wire strips do follow the standard, but the tri-bar light does not. So, the tri-bar light has a yellow and green, but they're not turn signals. And then you can see on the bottom right here the connector, the Y connector that you could be using to put in your rear wiring harness. So it's probably a good idea to design your wiring harness before you start working on it, just to get a little more organized. So I have this divided into 3 areas by the blue lines, the blue dotted lines. The one on the right is the OEM harness that you'll see coming out of the connector, and then the under seat connections, and then you have the rear fender connections. So the rear fender connections use the OEM manufacturer for the lights. They use those colors. Under seat is the Harley. I'm going to continue the Harley colors to the back of the bike. So I'm showing you these pictures here because I want to show you what not to do. Okay. Now I took this taillight lens off of the bezel, the housing, and the reason is because I'm changing to a low profile smoke lens. But I thought I would show you the wiring that goes in the back here. Now some people might be tempted to cut this wiring, cut the big black coverings, cut those off, and then cut the insulation and actually try to tap into these wires. Seems like something that might be easy, and it might be, but there's no way you can tap into these wires and solder and then re-insulate the wires and make it waterproof again. This is just not a good idea. And you can see some black wires coming out of the left side here. That's for the lighting that went underneath the turn signal bar that was put in supposedly by Harley. I just ripped that out. They didn't actually tap into these wires, but they use this area to run the wires. So I just pulled that back through. I'm not worried about that accent lighting right now. But just don't even think about tapping into these wires. You can see on the right that square, plastic part in the left picture with the arrows showing you all the connectors that go into it. That fits into the area that I have dotted on the right. And, it crushes this foam here, which is a sealer. It's probably a 1/4 inch thick foam. And there's just no room in there for wiring. There's no room to tap in. So, just don't even think about this. Not standard, not a good idea. So here is what I ordered for a Y connector. Because why? Because a couple of different places, being J&P and Dennis Kirk, told me this is what I need. If you have a 97 to 08 bike, this, is not the correct connector. It will not work with your bike. I ordered it because I talked to the people and they said, yeah, this is what you need. So I ordered this, it came in, and then I could see it's not the right part. So the Harley rear fender connector has 6 wires: red, black, blue, purple, brown, and orange. This could be okay if you have an Ultra, but it would only work on a Rushmore and later bike. As you can see, the connectors, if you follow, there's a big ass wiring harness that goes through the rear fender. So, take your seat off, look at that big thing that comes from the rear fender, and look at the connector it's connected to. So this is this connector is actually an 8 location connector with 6 wires in it, and it has 3 wires on the top row and 3 wires on the bottom row. So that connector that you might see in a bunch of different places, the connector on the left, the Y connector, that's what you need, but it's not going to work on this bike. And unfortunately, Harley doesn't make, or they never did make, a connector for this 6-pin connector where you have 3 pins and 2 rows. So there's the same number of wires, there's 6 wires, but 3 pins on top, 3 pins on the bottom. And you can tell the new connector is not going to fit in there. So that's an issue. And I had people looking at this, Dan at Rubber City Harley, he investigated this quite a bit. He gave me the part numbers for the plastic connectors, but then he also looked and said that, there's no Harley dealers in the region that have these connectors in stock. And he also gave me the connectors for the pins too. So you have the part number, which is 73158-96BK, and then the pins are 73158-96, and you need 6 of those pins. So you'd have to buy the connectors and the pins, and you're going to find that to be impossible because there's no Y connector made, and these connectors aren't made anymore, and they're going to be really hard to find. Then this is the other part. This is the male part that's part of the wiring harness. The female part plugs into this. The part number on it is 73140-96BK, and the pins are 73140-96. And again, you need 6 pins. And these pins are rectangular pins, so round pins are not going to work. So he gave me all these part numbers, and there's a little bit bigger view of what this connector looks like on the bottom left. That photo right there shows you what the connector looks like. Rectangular pins, 8 positions. In the top row you have pins at the first location and then the last 2. And on the bottom it's like the middle 2 and 1 on the left. It's just a crazy looking connector. And Harley used a little bit bigger connector than what they need because in the future they can use the same connector if they add more wires. This is common practice in the automotive industry. But the thing is, it's common practice to also give the users a Y connector so they can, run their own wiring harness. And that isn't available through Harley. Now, I did find a dealer on the East Coast that actually had both of these plastic parts in stock and the female pins, but they didn't have the male pins, which means you're going to be looking for rectangular male pins that are made for this connector. So good luck doing that. If you took it to a Harley dealer, what they would do is, make their own connectors. So I don't know what they would do in, this area of the country, the Great Lakes area, because all the Harley dealers don't stock the parts for their technicians to make a part. So they would probably do what I did. I would think they would do what I did. If not, they should be doing what I did. So the only alternative here is to cut off the Harley connectors because they're not made anymore. They're obsolete. You can't find them. You can't find anything to plug into this. And neither can your Harley technicians. I had 2 Harley dealers here. I had another Harley dealer, Southeast Harley. And, both of these guys, and the guy with Rubber City works in another Harley dealer too. So that's really 3 Harley dealers. And like I said, they looked at everything in the region where they can order from, and nobody has this stuff in stock. So the only alternative is to cut off the Harley connectors and put in a new connector of some sort that you can buy with a 6-pin connector, 6-pin to 6-pin connector. So you can look on eBay and find 6-pin connectors. Or, I already paid $40 for this part from J&P, and I thought, well, it is the new part that new Harleys use. So I may as well use this thing and put it in where the old connectors are. But like I said, don't do this unless you think you can do it. Otherwise, you're going to be riding your Harley to a dealer without any brake lights or rear lights at all, and saying, "Hey, fix my bike," and you'll probably see it in 2 months. Harley dealers are really, now it's July 2020, and the people in these Facebook touring groups and all the Harley groups are complaining about the time that their dealers have their bike, because tires are back ordered, fuel pumps are back ordered, a lot of parts are back ordered, and if your bike has got something wrong with it and makes it not rideable, it's going to be sitting at a Harley dealer for a long time. So here are some 6-pin connectors that you can get. Now this Molex type, these are actually, first appeared in Germany. And these Molex connectors are good, but I don't recommend using them. Not in this application. They would be good in a wiring harness where you're just going to connect something together and leave it. The problem with these is, you crimp the wires on you crimp these connectors onto your wires. And I would crimp them and solder them, which you might have to jack up the heat a little bit from 375 to get this connector hot enough to, have hot solder connect to it really well. But the problem with these connectors is, once you connect them, they're just bare metal, and they're famous for corroding. And if you get these corroded and stuck together, if you go to disconnect the harness, which you would normally do in a wiring harness in a car, you don't usually disconnect things unless you're talking about a Tour-Pak. So like I said, they're really good in a wiring harness to connect two pieces of harness together. And, that's common in the automotive industry, because when people make wiring harnesses, they'll make a main harness, and then when it branches out to go to the left rear axle for for your analog braking system, or whether it goes to lighting systems, when it branches out they put these connectors in, which makes it easier in the assembly process, because you have a main wiring harness and you have all these branches coming off of it. Instead of trying to feed the main harness through everything, you use a connector, and then the thing that you're adding to the vehicle, like rear lights, you just connect the two connectors together, and then your wiring harness is complete. These are not made to be taken apart and put together often. And, the problem is they corrode. And when they corrode and you go to take them apart, you'll find that the female part is going to pull the male part through the front, and then you're going to have to deal with getting them disconnected and getting that part back in the plastic housing and making sure it doesn't pull through again. So, like I said, these aren't really made for being connected and disconnected, again and again, these Molex type connectors. So they're good to use in the wiring harness. Now these little blue things, I haven't used those yet, so I don't know how they work, how well they work. But these little blue things that you see in that middle picture on the left, that little thing is designed to go on the back of your connector and not pull through the housing or push through the housing. That's another problem. If it doesn't pull through when you pull them apart, when you go to put them back together, sometimes you'll push the female part or the male part back through the back of the housing. So these little blue things are made to prevent that from happening. I don't know how well they work. I didn't feel like experimenting on my bike. Now, if you look at the assembled 6-pin connectors, you'll see that they have wires already attached, and that way you just have to solder wires. You don't have to worry about pins pulling out, and because they're formed in the plastic when the piece is made. So this is a better solution than the one on the right. So Molex connectors can have pins pushed out of the back and pulled through the front. I highly recommend soldering over dealing with these Molex things. Molex things are great in a wiring harness when you're going to put it together and leave it forever, but they're not very good for taking apart and putting back together. So these assembled things, another reason why you might want to use these, they have another advantage. They come with a length of wire. So when you cut off the old connectors, if you go to solder a new wire to it, something's going to be a little shorter, right? Because part of your wire went with the connector you just cut off. So this gives you, when you use these things, it gives you another 5 or 6 inches of wire to play with. And that's something you might need. And definitely you will need it. So that's another reason for using these pre-assembled 6-pin connectors. So what I decided to do is take this, instead of sending this $40 part back and yelling at these guys for selling me the wrong thing, I decided to cut it in half, which doesn't leave you a whole lot of room. But, this is the solution that newer bikes use. So if you want to make your bike standard Harley, what the Harley solution is, they make this 6-pin connector, 6 pins all in one row. They have that on a new bike, and this is the Y connector for the new bikes. So if you want to put it in, if you're going to put a wire connector in your old bike, you may as well use the Harley standard one that's for newer Harleys now. Now on the left picture, you can see the piece of the connector that's connected to the main wiring harness. So this would connect to the piece that goes into your rear fender. Now I'm showing you this picture here, and I'm not showing you on the left side here is the little board where all your fuses are. So there's no room to pull it through, and also you can see a couple bolts going into the fender here. So you basically, you can't pull this through, so you have an extra 10 inches to play with. You have to deal with what this, you have to deal with this, 1.5 inches of wire, on the connector. And when you cut the new connector in half, you have the same problem. You have these really short leads of wire. So, there's no room to use those low temperature solder connectors. So I thought, well, okay, I'll do this the old fashioned way. So you can see I have the low temperature solder connectors there, and you really can't get them far enough away from the heat. They won't all go into the same wire cover. You can get a couple of them down far enough, but you can't get all 6 of them in there. So I decided not to use those, and then I decided to solder. So which means you're going to be soldering very, very short things together and still stacking shrink wrap, which I still managed to do. So here on the left, you can see that I have I put the shrink wrap on and stuffed them down into the shrink wrap down into that black tubing that's basically the wiring harness. And I connected, I guess, the male connector here, I think. And, then I brought the pieces of shrink wrap up and shrunk them. So you can see in the second picture here, this is the second layer of shrink wraps because there's no more shrink wrap in that tubing. And they're ready to be shrunk onto these wires. And also, on the next picture here, the third picture, since you're going to be soldering and using, something like a heat gun or a lighter to melt the shrink wrap, wrap something around your connector so you don't melt it. So this is a few pieces of heavy gauge foil wrapped around there so I don't damage it. You're working with something that's really close quarters here. And on the right picture, you can see the first layer of shrink wrap is already on, and the brown wire, the second layer is already put on. You can see it's not, you can't see the soldering connections underneath it that well because there's two pieces of shrink wrap. And then the other ones, you're going to bring those up. And these pieces of shrink wrap, the first ones are probably only like 3/4 of an inch. And the second one is maybe 1 1/4 inches or something like that. You just don't have much room here. Then you can see on the left picture, done, finished. So, it's doable. It took me a little over an hour to do this. So it's doable, but you have to be pretty good at soldering, and you have to be pretty patient. You have to be willing to work in really close quarters here because, there's just not enough room. But the end result is you have these new connectors connected, and you have your wire lead for the new wiring harness that you're going to make. And then after I got through, soldering everything together, I wrapped it really well with electrical tape, and then I put some of that split conduit on it and taped it in, and then you have what you want. And not only do you have what you want, these extra wires are going to go to your wiring harness, but in the future somebody can take this connector apart and put in another Y connector and get another bunch of leads for something else. But I mean, that's the standard, procedure for doing things. When you just take a connector apart and you put a Y connector in it. So that's why I went with the Harley design, just to keep everything Harley. So in the future, somebody, that might want to tap into this can buy another one of these Y connectors, because they're readily available and they're used on the new bikes. And of course, before you do your soldering, after you twist the wires together, you should test all your rear lights, which I did. And then I tested them again after they were soldered, and everything works right. So here you can see the strips. I was testing this before. Oh, this is probably after. But the LED strips should illuminate as a running light as soon as you turn the lights on, as soon as you turn the ignition on. And then if you hit the brakes, you should see them get illuminated more. And then when you put the turn signals on, since you have the yellow and green wire connected together, the top and the bottom are going to flash in unison on the left side and then the right side. So things are working out the way I designed it to work. Of course, that means the wiring harness is already done, which we haven't covered yet. Oh no, I'm sorry. These lights are just laying underneath the seat just to test them. I didn't make the wiring harness yet. So back to the wiring harness. Now you can see the picture on the left. This is like a soldering day for me, just soldering like crazy. So the yellow and green wires are connected together, and they're going to the purple wire, whether that's left or right turn signal, I forget. Purple and brown is what Harley uses. And then the red goes to red, the white goes to blue, and the black goes to black. So this is for the LED strips, and I'm soldering those to the wiring harness. And again, I'm stacking the shrink wrap, so there's at least a couple layers of shrink wrap here. And then after I do that, I'm also going to use that conduit. So after you put in your wiring harness and you connect everything in the back, and you get ready to connect this to the new Y connector that you just put in, all you have to do here is connect all the similar colored wires together. So first, twist them together before you solder them and test the rear end, test your brake lights and your turn signal and your running lights, and everything should work. So then you're ready to start soldering again. So there are 4 groups of wires that need to be connected. You have the wiring harness running down the left side of the bike and on the right side of the bike, and I connected the wiring harnesses to the fender the way new Harley does it. There's actually holes in the fender for wire ties for connecting wiring harnesses going to the rear that they provide you with if you want to add your filler light later or whatever. Harley, gives you those places to connect to the fender. You can also connect it to the fender without holes, just by looking at the hardware around the fender. So that's what I did. So when you're ready to connect these together, you're going to have, 4 groups of wires. Some of the groups are going to have 4 connecting, like you're going to have 4 blue wires connecting to each other, 4 red wires, 4 black wires. The brown and the purple, though, you're going to have 3 connecting wires. So, you're going to have 2 sets connecting to their main wiring harness. So that's explained on that, on the text on the right. So again, set up a little work area here on your bike, and now you're working on connecting the wiring harness to the Y connector. So you can see the purple is something I already soldered together. Once you solder these together, again, I test them. It just takes a couple seconds to test it. Turn on the ignition, see if you have running lights, hit the brakes, turn on the emergency flashers or the turn signals, and you've tested everything. and then shrink wrap it. So again, the soldering gun is set up to 375 degrees. And like I said, most of these things are 2 wires into 2 wires. You twist 2 wires together and connect those to the other 2. Except for purple and brown, it's 2 into 1 because, the purple and brown are running down the left side and the right side of the bike. There's only 1 on the side. And also double layers of shrink wrap again. So after you're done, you have a mess that looks like this. Now this is a mess. And I don't have, the new Y connector. It has the conduit, the split conduit connected and taped, but I still am not done wrapping up all the wires here. So, and again, these black and white or black and red wires that are underneath everything here, that's for a custom lighting system, which I am not worried about right now. So, now, I ran into a problem where the LEDs failed after I put them in, and that's because why? Because they're Chinese. So I do have to connect new LED wires in, and also here the license plate light is not working, and the reason it is because I lost my license plate light. I'm surprised I only lost 2 things during this whole project, and one was the license plate light. I never did find it, the 3 LED one. So I had to go to the 5 LED lights. Now, when I ordered these 5 LED strips, neither one of them worked. And, I wrote to the guy selling it. I said, what the hell? This doesn't work. And he sent me a new one, and it doesn't work either. I connected it directly to a battery, and they don't work. And so since I couldn't find my other one, I thought, well, let's see what doesn't work here. And I attached a couple of jumpers directly to the circuit board with the LEDs, and it worked. So I thought, well, then I connected it again to the end of the wires, and it doesn't work. So the problem is in the wiring, So whoever in this Chinese factory that's making these things, the soldering, for connecting the wiring to this little tiny circuit board actually melts the wire inside of the insulation, and you get breaks in the wire. So that's what the case was. Both of them had burned out wires, about 1/8 of an inch back from the circuit board. And if you order these, you'll find, the same problem with your lights, but you can get these to work if you want to. Now you can see on the second picture here, I'm testing the leads and it's lighting up my test light. But, and then, directly to the battery, these things work, but not with the wiring. So that means I have to use my own wiring. And I just happen to have some black with a red tracer and red. And I ran it from the original Harley wiring harness that went to the accent light on the bottom of the fender. And now I'm setting up a little work area. There's a little piece of plywood set up on the left luggage rack hardware on the bottom. I keep making these little benches, to work on. And these pair of vice grips are not, they're just set at an opening to where if I drop these LEDs in, it'll hold it while I'm soldering, so that the vice grips aren't, gripping the glass. It just happens to be a good holder for right now. So I soldered new wires in, and then guess what? It started working again. Then I noticed that these new lighting fixtures don't fit, because I had, I lost the LED light that does fit. So I took the license plate frame off, which never was, completely connected. It wasn't, I didn't have Loctite in it. I didn't even have all of the bolts tightened. So I took that bracket out that I made, and I put it in a vise, and I bent it with this big, clamp. This is a parallel clamp. It doesn't mar anything, and it gives you a lot of leverage. So put that in a vise and bend it, and then I put it back in, and now you can see there's an extra inch of room in here, and these other lights will fit. The ones that didn't work, will fit. And it changed the angle by, maybe several degrees, and now it's basically vertical, and the flag is straight up and down now. It just doesn't make much of a difference, but it gives you a little bit more room in there if you want to bend this thing. So way back in the other section when I was making this thing, if you bend it right after you make it, you won't have to take it out and bend it again. So now this is what the rear of my bike looks like on the left. And the little flag there is, this is looking down on it. The flag doesn't cover any part of the license plate if you're back about 5 feet. So this is kind of what it looks like before I put black silicone in there and sealed everything. And this is what the lights look like with the lights off. And you can see this is total darkness here, but I do have the headlights on, so that's why the walls are lit up a little bit. But you have the LED strips as a running light and brake lights, and same with the tri-bar light on the bottom, and then you also have turn signals. So now it's time to clean up the wiring disaster underneath the seat. So I have the seat laying here on a couple of workbenches, or a couple of stools, I mean, and it's lined up to where the back bolt and the front lines up, so I can see where I have room to work and where I don't have room to work. So you can see there's a boatload of room just behind, just in front of your rear fender. There's a lot of room there because those two bolts are made for a rider backrest, and it won't take up any more than a few inches there. So, that's a good place to put all your wiring. So I just have the seat, lined up there so I can see where I can stuff the wiring and where I don't want to stuff the wiring. Like underneath the front, you can see that plate where your seat, connects to, that big piece of plate sticking out there. Don't put any wires on that. Don't run any wires across the top of the control unit there because it's finned and probably gets hot. And not only that, there's an opportunity for abrasion there, so just keep that area clear too. So then I started bundling up the wires, and the last thing that I bundled up was the three cables that go to the rear end of the bike, and I put wire connectors on them. And I figured every time I put the Tour-Pak on, if I'm just going to the grocery store or something and I feel like going in a bike instead of a car just to get some wind, I'll disconnect. I won't disconnect these wires and hook up the lights in the Tour-Pak. Why? Because I have enough lights on the rear end of the bike. So I'll just leave these bundled up most of the time when I have the Tour-Pak put on just for short trips. If I'm going to put the Tour-Pak on for a couple of weeks, I'll cut these wire connectors and connect them to the back of the bike. That only takes an extra minute. But the thing is, when you want to tie them up again, it's going to take 5 to 10 minutes to get them all wrapped up together, and made neat underneath your seat.